Okay, so are you ready to dive into this? We're talking about the history of the United States, going all the way back to the time before European settlers arrived on the scene. It's easy to think about those early English settlements as the very beginning, but
Right, it wasn't just some vast empty land just waiting for them to show up.
exactly. In fact, there were already vibrant civilizations thriving here long before the English even set sail.
Oh, absolutely. Take the Anasazi, for instance.
Oh, you mean the ones who built those incredible cliff dwellings, right?
Those are the ones. I mean, can you imagine the kind of engineering skills and social organization it must have taken to create something like that, especially in such a rugged and unforgiving environment?
It's mind-boggling, and it makes you realize how much we can learn from those who came before us, how they adapted, innovated, and left their mark on the world. But speaking of those who came before, I've always been fascinated by the debate surrounding the origins of those early inhabitants.
Yeah, it's a story that's been rewritten time and time again as new discoveries come to light. For the longest time, the prevailing theory was that people migrated from Asia over that land bridge, the Bering Strait, thousands and thousands of years ago. But get this.
How's that?
Recent discoveries are throwing a wrench in that timeline.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, there have been some pretty remarkable archaeological finds that challenge the conventional wisdom, like the Kennewick Man. Yeah. A skeleton found in Washington state, it dates back like 9,000 years. And here's the kicker. The skull features, they look more European than Asian. And then there's the Spirit Cave mummy from Nevada. Same deal, non-Asian features. These discoveries, combined with, all the advancements in genetic analysis and whatnot, have some researchers suggesting there might have been multiple waves of migration from different corners of the globe, maybe even contact with Europe way earlier than anyone thought possible.
Wow, that really changes things, doesn't it?
It really does.
Just goes to show you, history is never truly settled. There's always something new to uncover, some new perspective to consider. Kind of makes you wonder what other surprises are still buried out there, just waiting to be found.
You got that right. And, that whole idea of migration, people moving and interacting and leaving their mark, it's a theme that runs through the entire history of the United States.
That's so true. I mean, even when Europeans started showing up in larger numbers, they weren't exactly stepping into a pristine and untouched land.
Yeah, they weren't exactly walking into an empty room, were they?
Not at all. And from what I understand, the Spanish, with all their conquistadors and their lust for gold, they weren't exactly racing to set up shop in what we now call the United States, were they?
Not really. You see, they were busy conquering empires further south, and in Mexico and South America, places where the gold and silver were flowing. So this part of North America, well, it just didn't hold the same allure for them, at least not initially.
So while the Spanish were busy building their empires further south, other European powers saw an opportunity up north, huh?
Exactly. The French, for instance, they were all about the fur trade. They established a strong presence around the Great Lakes, made alliances with the Native American tribes already living there, and built a pretty lucrative business on all those furs. But here's the thing, and this is important, they also explored and claimed vast swaths of land along the Mississippi River, which, as you can imagine...
Oh, I bet that comes back to bite someone later on.
You know it does. And that, my friend, is where those 13 British colonies come into the picture.
Clinging to the eastern seaboard, right?
That's right. And they didn't exactly luck out in the real estate department, did they?
What do you mean?
Think about it. The prime locations, the ones with all the gold and silver and those established civilizations, those were long gone. The eastern seaboard, that was kind of like the leftovers.
Interesting how things turn out, huh? What was once considered leftover land would eventually become the birthplace of a nation.
It really is. But you hit on something important. Those colonies, they weren't all cut from the same cloth, were they? You had a real mix of folks over there.
Yeah, you had those seeking religious freedom, folks chasing economic opportunity, and even some running from their past. It was a real melting pot of cultures and backgrounds.
And that mix of people, they shaped those colonies in profound ways. You had the New England colonies with their deep religious roots, the southern colonies built on the backs of agriculture, and the middle colonies trying to find that sweet spot in between. And as you might imagine, these regional differences, they didn't just disappear once the colonies decided to band together. They would go on to shape not just how those colonies developed, but also the very character of the nation they'd eventually become.
It's almost like the seeds of their future were sown right there from the start.
Absolutely. It was a potent mix of diversity and division. On the one hand, all that diversity was a source of strength and dynamism, but it also set the stage for some pretty serious tension down the line.
How so?
Well, those differences we talked about, those contrasting social structures, those clashing economic interests, and of course, the looming specter of slavery, they were all simmering beneath the surface, just waiting for the right moment to boil over.
Okay, so we've got these 13 colonies, each with its own unique flavor, all under the thumb of British rule. But how do we go from a bunch of colonies complaining about tea to a full-blown revolution? I mean, what was the tipping point?
Well, you got to remember that by the mid-18th century, those colonies had gotten used to a certain amount of self-governance.
They had their own thing going on.
They did. They had their own assemblies, levied their own taxes, and enjoyed a level of autonomy that, frankly, the British government wasn't too keen on letting slide any longer, especially after a costly war with France.
You mean the 7 Years' War?
The one and only. It completely drained the British treasury, and, well, they figured the colony should probably chip in for the bill.
Hence, all the new taxes.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the infamous Stamp Act of 1765. It might seem like a small thing now, a tax on paper, but back then it was like lighting a fuse to a powder keg.
Tell me about it. I mean, forcing the colonists to pay a tax on every piece of printed material, from newspapers and legal documents to even playing cards, that was a direct hit to their sense of autonomy and freedom, and they weren't about to let it stand.
And that's when that famous cry rang out, no taxation without representation. It captured the very heart of their grievance, that they were being taxed by a distant parliament without having a say in the matter.
It was a rallying cry that united the colonies in opposition to British rule. And, you know, it's easy to look back and see the revolution as inevitable, but it's crucial to remember that things weren't quite as black and white back then as they might seem now.
What do you mean?
Well, it wasn't simply a case of good guys versus bad guys. Both sides had legitimate grievances.
So the British weren't just being tyrannical overlords.
Not exactly. The British, they were coming from a different perspective entirely. They saw the colonists as British subjects, plain and simple, subject to the authority of the Crown and Parliament. As far as they were concerned, they had every right to impose taxes as they saw fit. And remember, they were still reeling from that war with France, so trying to replenish their coffers probably seemed like a pretty reasonable thing to do.
So it was a clash of perspectives, a fundamental disagreement about how power should be structured and who had the right to govern.
Exactly. The colonists, they believed that their local assemblies, the ones they elected themselves, were the true voice of the people. The British, on the other hand, well, they believed that Parliament represented the interests of the entire British Empire, colonists included.
It's like two ships passing in the night, each one convinced it was on the right course.
That's a perfect way to put it. And you know what happens when two ships on a collision course refuse to change direction?
Someone's in for a rude awakening.
You got it. Yeah, and you know what? All that tension, all those disagreements, they eventually erupt into something truly remarkable. I mean, you're talking about a revolution that would not only reshape North America, but also inspire movements for freedom and self-determination all over the world.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you really think about it. This group of, well, let's face it, they were colonists going up against the biggest, most powerful empire on the planet at the time. What were the odds of them actually pulling it off?
Honestly, the odds were stacked against them. I mean, the British had the military might, the resources, the experience, you name it. But here's the thing about those colonists. They had a few tricks up their sleeves.
Like what?
Well, for starters, they were fighting on home turf. They knew the land, and they had a powerful motivator. They were fighting for their homes, their families, for their vision of the future.
And let's not forget the power of ideas. I mean, the Declaration of Independence, with its bold pronouncements about universal rights and self-government, that wasn't just some document. It was a rallying cry, a beacon of hope that resonated far beyond those 13 colonies.
You're absolutely right. The Declaration of Independence, it was rooted in the colonists' grievances, sure.
Yeah.
But it also articulated these principles that had a universal appeal. The idea that everyone is created equal, that we all have certain inherent rights that can't be taken away. Those ideas, they were aspirational, sure, especially given the reality of slavery at the time. But they were powerful nonetheless, and they would go on to inspire generations of reformers and revolutionaries all around the world.
It just shows you how potent those ideas can be. They could literally change the course of history.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to declare independence. It's quite another to actually win a war against a global superpower like Great Britain.
No kidding. The Revolutionary War, it was brutal, it was costly, there were twists and turns galore. But through sheer grit, determination, and a few strategic alliances. Oh, and let's not forget the French.
The French.
Yeah, the French saw an opportunity to stick it to their British rivals, so they threw their support behind the colonists, and that, my friend, made all the difference. The colonists, with a little help from their French friends, managed to tip the scales in their favor.
Wow, so it really was a global power play from the start.
Oh, absolutely. The American Revolution wasn't just some isolated event. It had ripples that were felt all over the world, reshaping alliances and inspiring other struggles for independence. But once the dust settled, the British were sent packing, and there it was, a brand new nation, the United States of America.
The United States of America. It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? But I imagine the hard work was just beginning. They had to build a government from scratch, forge a national identity, and somehow navigate all the growing pains of a young and rapidly changing nation. Where do you even begin with all that?
Well, it was a time of intense debate and compromise, that's for sure. I mean, you've got those founding fathers that everyone always talks about. Those guys were a diverse bunch with a whole range of views on what the new nation should look like.
You had Alexander Hamilton, a staunch advocate for a strong central government. And then, in the other corner, you had Thomas Jefferson, a champion of states' rights and individual liberty.
Exactly. And those disagreements, they weren't just philosophical differences. They reflected these deeper tensions about power, about representation, about the very soul of this new republic they were trying to create.
It sounds like there were some pretty heated arguments back then. So how did they ever manage to bridge those divides? How did they create a system of government that, for the most part, has stood the test of time?
Well, it took a whole lot of pragmatism, a healthy dose of compromise, and a shared belief that the success of this whole grand experiment in self-government depended on their ability to find common ground. And the result of all that was the Constitution, a document that's been revered and debated, interpreted and reinterpreted for centuries.
The Constitution. It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's a document written centuries ago, and it still shapes debates about rights and liberties and the role of government today.
It's remarkable, but, it wasn't all smooth sailing back then. There were some pretty significant bumps along the way.
You mean they didn't manage to iron out all the wrinkles in that first draft?
Not quite. Let's just say they kind of kicked the can down the road when it came to certain, shall we say, uncomfortable issues.
You're talking about slavery.
Bingo. It was a tragic compromise, one that would continue to haunt the nation for generations to come.
Yeah, it's tough to reconcile those lofty ideals of liberty and equality enshrined in the Constitution with the brutal reality of slavery that continued to exist within the very same system.
It's a stark reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. It's messy, full of contradictions and moral compromises. But anyway, so you've got this new nation, a new government, but geographically speaking, they're still mostly huddled along that eastern seaboard. And then, bam.
Westward expansion.
You got it. A potent cocktail of ambition, opportunity, and something a lot of folks were calling manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny. It sounds so, I don't know, preordained, like it was their God-given right to expand across the continent.
That's pretty much the gist of it. It fueled westward migration, the acquisition of new territories, and a sense of national purpose. But all of that came at a steep human cost.
It's a complicated story, isn't it? On the one hand, you have this incredible expansion, new frontiers opening up, economic opportunity booming. But on the other hand, it came at the expense of Native American tribes who were driven from their land, their treaties disregarded.
It really highlights how history is rarely black and white. You have to hold those contrasting perspectives, the achievements, the injustices, to truly understand how we got to where we are today.
It's a part of our history we can't afford to forget. And as if westward expansion wasn't enough, there's another revolution brewing at the same time.
The Industrial Revolution. The speed at which the United States transformed from an agricultural society to this industrial powerhouse is staggering.
It really is. What fueled that kind of rapid change?
Well, several factors came together. For one, the U.S. had a labor shortage compared to Europe, which spurred innovation. They needed labor-saving machines, technologies to bridge the gap.
Necessity really is the mother of invention.
Tell me about it. Plus, remember that westward expansion we talked about? That created a massive market for manufactured goods.
Yeah.
You suddenly have this growing population spread across the continent, and they need everything. Railroads, steel, textiles, you name it. The demand was insatiable.
So you have new technologies, resources, a workforce bolstered by immigration, and a booming market. It's like a recipe for industrial growth.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing for everyone.
You're right. While industry titans like Carnegie and Rockefeller amassed incredible fortunes, the working class, many of them recent immigrants, they faced a different reality. Long hours, meager wages, dangerous conditions, and very little protection.
It's hard to imagine the difficult choices those families had to make just to get by.
Absolutely. And you also saw a rise in social unrest during this time. Immigrants, factory workers, wealthy industrialists, they were all competing for limited resources, for power, for a place in this rapidly changing world.
It makes you wonder, when does a nation stop being new? Is it a matter of time, or is it something more?
That's a good question. Maybe a nation comes of age when it finally confronts its own contradictions, its internal struggles. And for the United States, that moment came with the Civil War.
The Civil War, a nation divided, pitted against itself over the institution of slavery. It's hard to imagine a more turbulent period in American history.
It was a tragedy on a massive scale. Over 600,000 Americans died in that conflict, a conflict that stemmed from decades of tension over slavery, states' rights, the very definition of the Union.
And it exposed the painful truth that those ideals of liberty and equality, they didn't apply to everyone.
Sadly not. The Civil War forced the nation to confront its hypocrisy, that gap between those lofty ideals and the reality of slavery.
And while the Union ultimately held and slavery was abolished, the fight for true equality was far from over.
Not by a long shot. Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, was a mixed bag of progress and setbacks. There were efforts to integrate formerly enslaved people into society, to rebuild the South, to redefine the relationship between the states and the federal government. But these efforts were met with resistance, with violence, and ultimately a retreat from the promise of true racial equality.
It's a time of both hope and disillusionment, a time when the seeds of future struggles for civil rights and social justice were sown.
Absolutely. The Civil War and its aftermath, they were a turning point. They settled the question of slavery, but they opened up a whole new set of questions about citizenship, about equality, about what freedom truly meant in a nation still grappling with its past. And in many ways, those questions continue to resonate today.
And on that note, we come to the end of our deep dive into the history of the United States. We've journeyed from those pre-colonial societies to the birth of a nation, through westward expansion, industrial revolution, and the agonizing test of civil war. It's a complex story, full of triumphs and tragedies, of progress and setbacks, of the enduring power of ideas and the ongoing struggle for a more perfect union. But above all, it reminds us that history isn't some dusty old textbook. It's a living, breathing narrative, one that shapes who we are, how we see the world, and the choices we make today. Thanks for joining us.